The night was thick with smoke and tension, the kind of heavy silence that could only be broken by a single, decisive moment. Inside the dimly lit back room of a Harlem speakeasy, Bumpy Johnson's most trusted enforcer stood, his eyes scanning the room, his every muscle poised for action. He didn't speak much, but when he did, people listened. He didn't need to shout, to show off. His presence alone commanded respect. His name was known throughout the streets of Harlem, and it carried weight that few others could match. But on this particular evening, the weight of his presence would be measured by the sound of a bullet. A group of outsiders, unfamiliar with the delicate balance of power in Harlem, had decided to make a move. They were young men, bold with their money and new to the game, thinking they could push into Bumpy's territory without consequence. They didn't understand the rules of the streets. They didn't know what it meant to cross a line that wasn't meant to be crossed. One of them, a cocky young gangster from Jersey, had been running his mouth all night, speaking disrespectfully about Bumpy Johnson, about Harlem, about the men who had made this place what it was. He hadn't even realized what he was doing. Didn't understand that in Harlem, respect wasn't something you could buy. It was something you earned, and if you disrespected the wrong man, there would be hell to pay. His name was Tony the Razor D'Amico, and tonight he would learn a lesson he would never forget. The room grew colder as the men from Jersey laughed and joked, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. But the moment D'Amico turned to face the silent enforcer, his smile faltered. He had crossed a line, but he didn't know it yet. "You don't belong here," D'Amico sneered, his words slurring with bravado and alcohol. "This is our turf now. You're all just a bunch of old-timers who got lucky. Times are changing." The room fell silent. Trigger, Bumpy's right-hand man, didn't respond immediately. He never did. He simply stood there, letting the weight of his silence press down on D'Amico. The others watched, waiting for something to happen. What they didn't know was that, in that moment, everything had already been decided. Trigger's gaze was enough to send a chill through the room. And then, without another word, he moved. The gunshot that followed was not loud. It didn't need to be. It was clean, precise and deadly, just like everything Trigger did. The bullet ripped through the air, striking D'Amico square in the chest. He dropped to the ground before he even had time to react. For a long moment, there was only silence until the sound of the bullet's echo faded into the background and the reality of what had just happened settled over the room like a heavy fog. That was how Trigger commanded respect. Not with words, not with threats, but with the certainty that came with knowing your power and being willing to back it up. And in that one single shot, he had sent a message that would be remembered for generations. Harlem, 1940s. The streets were alive with the pulse of jazz, the smell of fried food and cigar smoke lingering in the air, and the quiet hum of something much darker beneath it all. For decades, the heart of New York's black community had been a place of both brilliance and struggle. A city within a city where power was born in the shadows and loyalty was the one currency that always held value. And at the center of it all, towering above everyone else in the underworld, was Bumpy Johnson. The man was a legend in his own right, a name that commanded fear and respect from anyone who'd spent any amount of time on the streets. Bumpy had built his empire through a combination of grit, brains, and an unmatched ability to read people. He wasn't just a gangster, he was Harlem's protector. He understood the streets like no one else, and through his quiet dominance, he had earned control over Harlem's criminal landscape. No one dared cross him. But every king needs his enforcer, and for Bumpy Johnson, that man was Trigger. Trigger wasn't a name that was shouted on the streets. It wasn't a name that appeared in the gossip of Harlem's backrooms. Trigger was a ghost, silent, calculated, and deadly. His presence alone was enough to make even the hardest men hesitate. They didn't know his story, where he came from, or what drove him. But they knew one thing. To cross Bumpy Johnson meant crossing Trigger. And no one crossed Trigger. What few people understood was that Trigger had never wanted to be a figurehead. He wasn't in this for the money or the glory. He was in this for the code that Bumpy had built his empire on. It was a code of loyalty, respect, and absolute power. In Harlem, power wasn't something you flaunted. It was something you controlled, and if you controlled it, you earned the right to be feared. Harlem's streets had their own rhythm, the clinking of coins in dark alleyways, the steady beat of a drum in a jazz club, the hushed whispers of men making deals. But underneath the surface, everything in Harlem was always a negotiation, a delicate balance of power and influence. Bumpy Johnson had mastered it. He knew how to play the game. And Trigger was the enforcer who made sure the game was played fairly, by their rules. At this time, Harlem was on the cusp of a shift. The streets were being flooded with outsiders from across the river, men who thought their money could buy their way into Harlem's clubs, rackets, and businesses. The new blood were eager, ambitious, and often reckless. They didn't understand the laws of Harlem, and they especially didn't understand Bumpy's authority or Trigger's ability to defend it. D'Amico and his crew from Jersey had been just the latest of many who had stepped out of line. They were young, brash, and used to operating in a world where they thought they could get away with anything. They had money, connections, and ambition, but they had no respect for the established order in Harlem. And when D'Amico opened his mouth that night at the speakeasy, that was the final straw. Bumpy's men had seen this kind of thing before. Outsiders coming in, trying to bully their way into the fold. But this time, it wasn't just any outsider. D'Amico wasn't just some thug looking to make a name for himself. He was a challenge to the very essence of what Harlem stood for. He was a man who thought he could rewrite the rules without knowing what those rules were. And that made him dangerous. It wasn't the first time that Bumpy's crew had dealt with such threats, but it would be the last. Trigger, standing in the background, had watched D'Amico's every move. He had waited for the moment when the young man would show his true colors, when the disrespect would boil over. And when it did, Trigger didn't hesitate. He knew that sometimes one shot was all it took to put a man in his place. But what Trigger had done wasn't just about silencing a disrespectful outsider. It was about sending a message to everyone in Harlem and beyond that this was Bumpy Johnson's city. And in this city, respect was not negotiable. In the days following the incident at the speakeasy, the tension in Harlem was palpable. Word spread quickly. D'Amico, the cocky young gangster from Jersey, had been silenced by Bumpy Johnson's right-hand man. The streets buzzed with talk of the bullet that commanded respect. But as the whispers grew louder, so did the sense of uncertainty. The outsiders, the ones who had come to Harlem with the belief that they could take whatever they wanted, now had to decide, would they heed the message? Or would they challenge it? The challenge came soon enough. Tony D'Amico's death had not gone unnoticed. And while his own men may have been too afraid to retaliate directly, word of his death reached the ears of more dangerous men. The kind of men who understood the streets and the weight of Harlem's history. And these men didn't take kindly to seeing one of their own cut down so easily. They weren't in Harlem to play by anyone else's rules. They were in it for power. And the sudden loss of D'Amico was seen not as an isolated incident, but as an open wound to be avenged. In the shadows of Harlem, a rival gangster named Salvatore Big Sal Moretti had been growing his influence in the city. Moretti was no fool. He'd been around the block a few times, had been making waves in Brooklyn and Queens, and now had his sights set on Harlem. He had connections, money, and men willing to follow his lead. But more than that, he had a deep, burning desire to expand his empire, and he saw the elimination of D'Amico as the perfect opportunity to make a statement. Big Sal was different from D'Amico. Where D'Amico had been brash and reckless, Sal was calculating, methodical, and patient. He didn't see Trigger's gunshot as just the end of a disrespectful gangster's life. He saw it as a challenge, a public humiliation of his men. And Sal was no man to be humiliated. Behind closed doors, he began to strategize. His men were already working the streets, making quiet inquiries, talking to anyone who would listen. They wanted answers. Who was this Bumpy Johnson? Who was this shadow of a man who had silenced one of their own? And most importantly, what would it take to make Harlem bend to Moretti's will? Sal began making his own moves, creeping closer into Harlem's territory. He made contact with people on the fringes, the ones who were always looking for a way to climb up the ladder. His offer was simple: money, influence, control over the rackets that had once been Bumpy's. He promised them power, something they could never have while Bumpy Johnson ruled. But he was no fool. He knew that to challenge Bumpy head-on would mean bloodshed, and that wasn't the kind of battle he wanted. What he needed was a way to undermine Bumpy's empire without sparking an all-out war. His plan was to take Bumpy's enforcer out of the picture. The idea was straightforward. If they could eliminate Trigger, the man who had become the symbol of Harlem's power, then Bumpy's grip on the city would weaken. Without Trigger, Bumpy would be just another gangster, one who didn't have the muscle to back up his reign. But Sal underestimated the loyalty Bumpy commanded. He underestimated the bond that Trigger shared with the streets of Harlem. A few days after the confrontation at the speakeasy, Trigger began to notice something. There was a strange movement in the streets. His usual network of informants, men and women who knew every corner of Harlem, started reporting sightings of unfamiliar faces. Faces that didn't belong. More men had been asking about him, about Bumpy, about the shootout that had occurred. Some of them were new to Harlem, but others were old players, ones who had been pushed out of the city in the past and were now returning with new alliances. Trigger knew this was no coincidence. He knew Sal Moretti's name. Everyone in the city did. And he knew exactly what it meant. The challenge had been thrown. The message had been delivered. Sal Moretti was coming for Harlem, and he wasn't going to stop until Bumpy Johnson's empire was in ruins. But Harlem had one thing that Sal Moretti had never accounted for: loyalty. And Bumpy Johnson had earned it with blood, sweat, and respect. Trigger was more than just Bumpy's bodyguard. He was the embodiment of Harlem's unspoken law. He was the muscle that kept the streets in line, the enforcer of the city's code. And now, more than ever, Harlem would stand behind him. The evening of the confrontation arrived swiftly, and the tension in the streets of Harlem had reached a boiling point. By then, word had spread that Sal Moretti and his men were making their final move. Their presence was undeniable, their intentions clear. Sal had drawn his line in the sand, and now there was nothing left but for Harlem to answer. It was a crisp, cold night when the two worlds collided. The moon hung low over the rooftops, casting long shadows across the avenues. Harlem's streets, typically alive with music and laughter, felt like a powder keg about to explode. On one side stood Bumpy Johnson, the undisputed king of Harlem. On the other, Sal Moretti, a man who had chosen to test the limits of that kingdom. In the back room of a club near 125th Street, Bumpy, Trigger, and their closest allies gathered. The heavy smell of tobacco filled the air, and the quiet murmurs of the crew were the only sounds breaking the silence. Bumpy sat calmly at the head of the table, his face inscrutable, his eyes piercing as he considered the situation. He wasn't a man given to rage, but he understood the stakes. He understood what was at risk. Trigger stood by the door, as always, an unmovable figure. His presence alone was enough to send a clear message. Nothing would happen here tonight that Bumpy Johnson didn't allow. He was ready, always ready, but the time for action hadn't come yet. His role was simple. When the time came, he would act decisively. And then it came. The first shot rang out in the distance, a sharp crack that cut through the stillness of the night. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, many of them rushing toward the club. Sal Moretti and his men had arrived, and they were making their move. They weren't here to negotiate. They weren't here to talk. They had come to take control of Harlem. Bumpy stood, his chair scraping the floor with a force that echoed through the room. He wasn't surprised. He'd expected this. The question now was whether Moretti was truly ready for the consequences of his actions. As Bumpy made his way to the front door, his voice cut through the air, steady and commanding. "Trigger," he said without turning around. "Stay with me. Keep the streets clean." Trigger's gaze met Bumpy's, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. He didn't need orders. He had been trained in this very moment, the kind of confrontation where words weren't needed. His gun would do the talking. The club door creaked open, and the first man stepped into the light. It was Sal Moretti, flanked by half a dozen of his men. The tension between the two groups was almost unbearable, like two opposing forces about to collide. Sal's face twisted into a grin, but it was a grin that barely concealed the nervousness underneath. He had come prepared to fight, but what he didn't know was that he was standing in the presence of a living legend. "Well, well, if it isn't Bumpy Johnson himself," Moretti said, his voice oozing with mock cordiality. "I gotta say, you run a tight ship around here, Bumpy. But I think it's time someone else took the wheel." Bumpy's response was calm, his voice low but dripping with authority. "You don't get to take anything, Sal. You've made your move, and now you'll deal with the consequences." The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating, as each man measured the other. But it was the silence before the storm, the moment when the world was holding its breath. Sal's hand twitched toward his sidearm, and that was all Trigger needed. In one fluid motion, his hand was already on his gun, the revolver sliding into his palm like it was meant to be there. Without even looking, he raised it to eye level, aimed at the first man in Moretti's crew, and fired. The sound was deafening, the shot cutting through the room like a jagged knife. The man in the front crumpled, his body slamming into the ground with a sickening thud. The chaos that followed was quick, brutal, and precise. Trigger moved with the ease of someone who had done this 100 times. He fired again, and another man fell. There was no hesitation, no second thoughts, just action. Moretti's crew scrambled, some reaching for their guns, others ducking behind tables. But they were no match for Trigger. He was everywhere, a blur of motion and deadly precision. One by one, the men who had dared challenge Harlem's king fell before him. Sal Moretti, standing at the back of his group, fumbled for his gun, his expression a mix of disbelief and desperation. He had underestimated the power of the streets, underestimated the men who had built their kingdom here. He had come with ambition, but he hadn't come prepared for a war. Bumpy Johnson didn't move. He stood still, watching as Trigger dismantled the men who had come to steal his city. His eyes never left Moretti, who was now frantically trying to find a way out. Finally, the last of Moretti's men dropped to the ground. Silence fell over the room, heavy and suffocating. Trigger, his gun still smoking, didn't lower it immediately. He waited, scanning the room to make sure it was over. When he finally lowered the weapon, his eyes met Bumpy's. Bumpy nodded, a simple gesture that carried more weight than 1,000 words. Sal Moretti, now alone, stood frozen, his gun still gripped tightly in his hand. The realization had begun to sink in. He wasn't just outnumbered, he wasn't just outgunned, he was out of his depth. Bumpy stepped forward, his presence filling the room. Moretti's eyes darted around, looking for an escape, but he knew it was futile. There was nowhere to run. "You made your move," Bumpy said, his voice like a thunderclap in the stillness. "And now you'll learn the cost of crossing Harlem. This is my city. You're not welcome here." The silence in the room after the storm of gunfire was absolute. The bodies of Sal Moretti's men lay sprawled on the floor, the coldness of death already claiming them. Moretti, his face twisted in shock and fear, stood frozen, his hand still clutching the gun that had failed him. Bumpy Johnson's gaze was calm, unwavering, like a king watching the execution of a traitor. Trigger stood just behind Bumpy, the still smoking barrel of his revolver hanging loosely in his hand, his expression unreadable. He had done his job, but this was Bumpy's moment, Bumpy's justice. Moretti had made his move, and now it was time to pay the price. Bumpy didn't speak immediately. He didn't need to. His presence alone commanded the room. Slowly, he stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the wooden floor with an eerie calmness. Every man in the room, from the last of Moretti's men to the crew that had remained loyal to Bumpy, knew exactly what was about to happen. "You think you can just come into Harlem and take what you want?" Bumpy's voice was quiet, but it was a force that felt like it was coming from deep within the earth itself, rising to swallow anything in its path. "You think you can disrespect the people who built this city? My streets, Moretti tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. His bravado had evaporated, replaced by fear, raw, palpable fear. The realization was clear. Bumpy wasn't just a gangster. He was the protector of this place, and anyone who challenged him would be torn apart. "I made you a promise," Bumpy continued, his voice cutting through the tension like a sharp knife. "And I don't take promise this lightly. You didn't just make a mistake coming here. You made a mistake thinking that you could push the people of Harlem around, thinking you could play this game without knowing the rules." Sal's eyes flicked toward the door, then toward the men in Bumpy's crew, but there was nowhere to run. There was nowhere left for him to escape. Harlem had its code, and tonight it would be enforced. Bumpy moved closer, his gaze never leaving Moretti's trembling form. He reached out, gripping Moretti's chin and lifting his face so that their eyes met. "You wanted to take over. You wanted to test us, and you thought you could walk away from the consequences. Now you'll leave this city the same way you came in, empty." Moretti, desperate, dropped to his knees. "Please, I didn't know. I didn't mean—" Bumpy stepped back, and in that moment, Trigger's hand moved. With one swift motion, he raised his gun, aimed, and fired. The shot rang out, a single clean bullet that ended Moretti's life in an instant. There was no hesitation, no mercy, just justice. Trigger didn't even flinch as the body of Sal Moretti fell to the floor, his head snapped back with the force of the shot. The room was still again, save for the distant sound of cars passing on the streets outside, unaware of the bloodshed that had just occurred. For a long moment, no one spoke. There was no need to. The message had been delivered. Bumpy didn't need to say a word. The city knew. Harlem's streets knew. This wasn't just about one man or one bullet. This was about power. And in Harlem, power wasn't just claimed. It was earned, maintained, and defended with blood. Bumpy turned slowly, his face stoic as always. He surveyed the room, his men, Trigger, the bodies of Moretti's men, and then nodded, signaling that the job was done. His crew began to move, clearing the bodies, making sure the mess was handled. No one dared to question him. No one dared to challenge his authority. Harlem was his, and anyone who thought they could take it was now learning the hard way. In the days that followed, the story of the confrontation reverberated through Harlem like the echoes of a drumbeat. The bloodshed was swift, but the consequences were far-reaching. Moretti's death wasn't just a bullet in the chest. It was a message, loud and clear. A message to anyone who dared challenge the power of Bumpy Johnson and the ironclad grip of Harlem's streets. The underworld in New York City had always been a delicate balance. Rivalries shifted, alliances were made and broken, but one thing had always remained constant. Bumpy Johnson was the man to answer to in Harlem. The enforcer of that power was Trigger. And together, they represented something deeper than just criminal muscle. They embodied the very heart and soul of Harlem itself. In the weeks after Moretti's death, Harlem's streets grew quieter. The outsiders who had been circling, the ambitious mobsters who thought they could play the game, took the lesson to heart. The city wasn't some wild west where anyone could claim a piece of it. Harlem had its own rules, and if you didn't respect them, there were consequences. Bumpy Johnson's power remained unchallenged. His reputation, built over years of respect, loyalty, and decisive action, was now reinforced by the blood spilled on the floor of that club. He wasn't just a gangster. He was a king, a protector, and a symbol of Harlem's strength. His word was law in the city, and anyone who thought they could change that would learn just how costly their mistake would be. As for Trigger, his legendary status was solidified. The streets whispered his name with awe, not because he was a man who killed, but because he was a man who understood what it meant to protect what was his. He didn't speak much, but when he did, his actions spoke louder than any words could. He was the guardian of the code that Bumpy had built, the silent enforcer who made sure Harlem's power would never be questioned again. Trigger's bullet had done more than eliminate a threat. It had carved his name into the annals of Harlem's history. He wasn't just Bumpy's right-hand man. He was a legend in his own right. And from that moment on, no one in Harlem would ever forget that. The story of Bumpy Johnson and Trigger wasn't just about two men or the violence they brought to those who dared cross them. It was about respect, about understanding that power, when earned, becomes unshakable. Harlem, with all its grit and struggle, had built its own empire. And when that empire was threatened, there were men like Bumpy and Trigger to defend it. This wasn't just about one bullet. This was about the idea that no one, no outsider, no rival could come into Harlem and expect to take what wasn't theirs. It was about a city that had fought too long and too hard to be brought to its knees. Bumpy's response, through the silent justice of Trigger, was a reminder that power is always held by those who know how to protect it. And in the world of Harlem streets, Trigger's bullet would forever be a symbol of that unyielding strength. Harlem had always been more than just a place. It was a community. And sometimes it takes a legend to remind the world what respect really means. And when the world forgot, Harlem always remembered. The legend of Bumpy Johnson and Trigger wasn't just about one confrontation or one bullet. It was about the essence of respect, the kind that isn't given but earned. It was about the unspoken code that governed Harlem, a code that ran deeper than blood and power. It was a code that had been established through decades of struggle, loyalty, and sacrifice. A code that no one, not even the ambitious, money-hungry outsiders, could ever hope to break. When Sal Moretti made his move, he thought he was just playing the game, thinking his wealth and connections could buy him a piece of Harlem. He didn't understand that Harlem wasn't for sale. It wasn't about money or influence. It was about the streets, the people, the legacy. Moretti learned that lesson too late. The bullet Trigger fired didn't just take his life. It took the illusion that outsiders could take what they wanted without consequence. Bumpy's role wasn't just to build an empire. It was to protect it, to safeguard the very core of Harlem's existence. His ability to control the streets, to navigate the complexities of power, was what made him a legend. And while Bumpy was the face, the symbol, the one who negotiated with the powerful men of the world, Trigger was the one who made sure those negotiations were never tested. Trigger was the quiet force that ensured the kingdom Bumpy ruled would stand unchallenged. In Harlem, power is never absolute. It is fragile, always at risk of being taken. But through Bumpy and Trigger, it became clear that the price for disrespect was too high to ignore. Moretti had paid it, and anyone who followed in his footsteps would learn the same lesson. This was Bumpy's city, his streets, his empire. and through Trigger's swift, merciless justice, the balance had been restored. The lesson? Respect is not something you can buy, not something you can steal, not something you can demand. Respect is something you earn with your actions. It's something that stands firm in the face of challenges, unwavering, unbreakable. And sometimes it takes a legend, standing tall in the face of adversity, to remind the world that when you disrespect the code, there is always someone willing to protect it. Harlem never forgets, and as long as the streets are there, the legend of Bumpy Johnson and Trigger will remain eternal. A reminder that respect is the true currency of power, and that anyone who dares to take it without earning it will be shown the price they'll pay. In the end, Harlem's streets are always in charge, and as long as the legend lives, the price of disrespect will always be a bullet's worth. This concludes the story. Thank you for following the journey of Bumpy Johnson and Trigger. Would you like to reflect on the legendary impact of their actions further?